The skies above Europe during the Second World War were rarely still. Day and night, the drone of aircraft haunted both soldier and civilian alike, a reminder that danger could descend at any moment. For the American troops newly arrived on European soil, the threat of the German Luftwaffe was ever present. Imagine standing in an open field with little more than a helmet and rifle, knowing that at any moment a bomber might spot your position. The earth itself seemed to tremble as engines roared overhead, and each shadow in the sky brought with it the possibility of devastation. The battlefield was not only about trenches and gunfire, but about the constant fear of being exposed to the eye of the enemy above. In those early days of the campaign, the Luftwaffe appeared untouchable. German pilots commanded the skies with practiced confidence, sweeping across vast landscapes and searching for the slightest sign of Allied presence. Their vantage point gave them a deadly advantage. From above, a single movement of trucks, a cluster of tents, or even the glimmer of equipment could mark a target for destruction. To soldiers on the ground, it felt like fighting under a magnifying glass, where every error, every trace of visibility could be punished with bombs and fire. The challenge was not only to fight, but to remain unseen. The situation called for ingenuity, yet few could imagine what form that ingenuity would take. War, after all, was a world of iron and fire. It was tanks grinding through villages, artillery pounding hillsides, and rifles clattering in desperate rhythm. The idea that something as fragile as a balloon might alter this brutal contest seemed absurd. And yet, out of the desperation of soldiers and the ingenuity of commanders, balloons would soon enter the war, not as weapons of destruction, but as instruments of survival. To understand the atmosphere of this moment, one must imagine the psychological strain of constant aerial threat. A soldier digging a foxhole might hear the faint growl of engines long before the aircraft appeared. His heart would quicken, his shovel pausing as he glanced toward the horizon. Was it reconnaissance? Was it a bomber squadron? Would they pass overhead, or would they circle, signaling the doom of his unit? The suspense was relentless, the fear unshakable. War demanded courage, but it also demanded cunning. The Americans had no choice but to find a way to outwit the eyes in the sky. When the first balloons were introduced, their presence was almost comical. Inflated shapes rising against the backdrop of war looked strange, even foolish. Soldiers joked about them, comparing them to parade floats or carnival attractions. But beneath the laughter was a question. Could these odd creations really protect them? In a world dominated by steel and firepower, the balloons seemed fragile, almost laughable, yet they carried within them a promise. They were not designed to withstand bullets, but to bend perception, to twist what the enemy thought they saw. As American troops prepared their first deployments of these balloon decoys, the mood shifted. There was nervous skepticism, but also curiosity. Could a balloon mimic a tank well enough to fool a pilot? Could shadows and silhouettes deceive a trained eye at thousands of feet in the air? Each question carried weight, for the answers could mean the difference between survival and destruction. The stage was set for a new chapter in the struggle between the Americans on the ground and the German aircraft above. What followed would defy expectation. These seemingly fragile decoys would become a lifeline, a shield made not of armor, but of imagination. The war that had seemed so heavily tilted in favor of the Luftwaffe was about to change in ways no one could have predicted. For the men who lived beneath the thunder of engines, hope would come not in the form of more guns or thicker armor, but in the silent ascent of balloons drifting into place. In this unlikely beginning lay the seeds of deception, and the first step toward rewriting the balance of power in the skies. For the Luftwaffe, the key to their strength was clarity. Their reconnaissance flights mapped out Allied positions with meticulous precision, and their bombers followed swiftly, turning those observations into fiery destruction. The Germans trusted their pilots to see with absolute certainty. If a shadow on a field resembled a tank, it was marked for attack. If lines of equipment appeared to stretch across a clearing, it meant an encampment ready to be struck. This trust in sight had fueled their dominance, and for a time, it made them nearly unstoppable. But as the Americans began to deploy their first balloons and inflatable decoys, that clarity began to blur. From the ground, a soldier watching a balloon inflate might shake his head in disbelief. The fabric rustled in the wind, the shape wobbling into form, and slowly it resembled something more substantial. To a man standing only a few feet away, it looked fragile and artificial, hardly convincing. Yet high above, At the speed of a passing aircraft, the distinction was far less obvious. What appeared absurd at ground level became, at altitude, a convincing mirage. The contrast between perception and reality was startling. German pilots, who prided themselves on sharp eyes, found themselves reporting what they thought were long columns of vehicles. Commanders trusted these reports and directed bombing runs against them. The results were dramatic. Bombs detonated across open fields where no soldiers hid, no tanks rolled, and no artillery stood. The destruction, though powerful, fell on nothing of value. For the Americans, every explosion on empty soil meant safety for their real positions. Imagine being a Luftwaffe pilot, straining your eyes through the cockpit glass, convinced that you have spotted the enemy's armored strength. You dive, release your payload, and rise again to see flames and smoke where the supposed convoy stood. But from above, you cannot know that what you struck was only rubber and air, tethered to the earth with ropes. The illusion holds until it is too late. What once was certainty now slips into doubt, a seed of mistrust that spreads through the entire chain of command. For the Americans, this was a reversal of roles. They had been the hunted, the vulnerable, the ones hiding under camouflage nets and praying that the shadows of passing aircraft would keep moving. Now they held the advantage of trickery. The battlefield itself had become divided between truth and illusion, between what was real and what only seemed real. It was a clash not of firepower, but of perception. And in that clash, the fragile balloon stood against the iron wings of the Luftwaffe, reshaping the balance of fear. The contrast between the two sides could not have been sharper. The Luftwaffe relied on precision, on the ability to strike with deadly accuracy. The Americans relied on deception, on their enemy's overconfidence in sight. One side trusted the eye, the other sought to fool it. Out of this difference grew a new struggle. A contest in which the victor would not always be the one with the most bombs, but the one who could best control what the enemy believed to be true. The idea of using balloons as a weapon of deception was not born in a moment of inspiration, but rather in the grinding reality of necessity. Traditional defenses against air raids had proven inadequate. Camouflage nets could hide vehicles to a degree, and anti-aircraft guns could shoot down the occasional bomber, but neither could prevent the steady rain of destruction from above. American commanders realized that what they needed was not just to hide, but to mislead. To survive against an enemy with such aerial supremacy, the answer had to be found not in brute strength, but in misdirection. In workshops far from the front lines, the earliest balloon decoys were constructed with startling simplicity. Rubberized fabric was cut and stitched into forms that, when inflated, would resemble the silhouettes of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. These shapes were crude up close, wrinkled and soft, their outlines far from perfect, yet they carried the essence of what was needed. From the air, seen at high speed and through the distortion of distance, they became convincing enough to deceive even the most experienced pilot. What mattered was not perfection, but plausibility. The soldiers tasked with deploying these devices had to learn a new kind of craft. Instead of merely digging trenches or cleaning rifles, they became builders of illusions. They dragged heavy rolls of fabric across muddy fields, hammered stakes into the soil, and attached pumps to inflate the strange contraptions. Imagine the sound of air hissing into rubber, the balloon slowly swelling until its shape began to emerge. Laughter sometimes followed, as men compared the half-inflated form to a child's toy. But as the balloon rose higher, the laughter quieted. From a distance, it did not look so funny. It looked real. The origins of this strategy reflected a broader truth about war itself. In times of crisis, armies often turned to the most unlikely ideas. Balloons, objects associated with celebration or play, were transformed into instruments of war. The contrast was almost absurd, but it was also deeply practical. They were lightweight, easy to move, and quick to deploy. A handful of soldiers could carry and set up dozens of decoys in the time it took to move one real tank. This efficiency made them a natural choice for a military force, stretched thin across hostile ground. Over time, the use of balloons shifted from experimental to deliberate. Commanders began to factor them into their strategies, placing them in fields to suggest armored concentrations or along roads to mimic convoys. The soldiers who once joked about them now understood their value. Each balloon that went up represented a potential life saved, a real vehicle spared from destruction. In the cruel arithmetic of war, the strange decoys became part of the balance. At its heart, the story of balloon deception is a story of human adaptability. Faced with overwhelming odds, the Americans found a way to bend perception itself into a weapon. They could not match the Luftwaffe plane for plane, nor could they stop every bombing raid, but they could shift the battlefield into a place where shadows mattered as much as steel. The balloons, humble in appearance, were the beginning of that shift. Out of their strange shapes and fragile fabric grew a strategy that would confound one of the most powerful air forces in the world. When the first balloons were raised in contested zones, the reaction from soldiers on the ground was one of cautious curiosity. They watched as the fabric inflated and took form, the shapes tethered to the earth with ropes that strained against the wind. To the men who would soon face German air power, these decoys seemed almost too simple to matter. Yet the true test came not in their appearance from a few feet away, but in how they looked from thousands of feet in the air. And when the Luftwaffe descended, the impact was immediate. German bombers that had once struck supply depots and artillery positions with uncanny accuracy now unloaded their payloads on barren fields. Explosions thundered across the countryside, clouds of smoke rising over empty earth. Soldiers crouched in their foxholes could feel the ground tremble. But when the dust settled, their real tanks and weapons were untouched. The balloon had done its job, drawing fire away from what mattered most. For the first time, American troops felt that they had a shield, even if it was only made of fabric and air. Imagine the relief of a soldier crouching in the mud as bombs exploded half a mile away. The shockwaves rippled through the soil, but he knew that it was not his convoy being destroyed. It was an empty patch of land filled with decoys, now shredded but victorious in their sacrifice. Each successful misdirection meant another day of survival, another chance to hold the line. The balloons were not only decoys, they were lifelines in a war where every mistake could be fatal. The battlefield itself began to change. Movements once made under cover of darkness could now be attempted in daylight, knowing that German reconnaissance might be drawn toward the decoys instead. Real convoys shifted under camouflage while balloon convoys sat in open fields as bait. It became a game of shadows, where truth and illusion mingled until the Luftwaffe no longer knew which was which. This confusion disrupted their rhythm, slowing the pace of attacks and buying time for the Americans to organize their counter-offensives. The balloons did not win battles alone, but their contribution was felt in every clash where they appeared. German precision weakened, American morale strengthened, the line between survival and destruction grew thicker with every successful deception. What had once been a hopeless mismatch against aerial dominance was now a contest with unpredictable outcomes. The fragile fabric floating above the ground had altered the dynamic of combat, showing that even the most powerful enemy could be deceived. For the Luftwaffe, the frustration mounted. Their carefully planned raids no longer yielded the devastation they expected. Their intelligence reports grew inconsistent, their commanders questioning what was real and what was false. The Americans, once fearful of every shadow in the sky, now began to see opportunity in those very shadows. The battlefield was no longer defined solely by firepower. It had become a stage of illusions, where the silent presence of balloons shaped the course of the fight. As the balloon decoys proved their worth on the battlefield, their influence began to spread beyond immediate survival. German pilots who once flew with absolute confidence now returned to their bases with doubt in their reports. Intelligence officers sifted through conflicting accounts, some swearing they had seen vast armored columns, while others insisted the ground below was empty. This uncertainty eroded the precision that had long been the Luftwaffe's greatest advantage. Every minute spent questioning their observations was a minute lost in the chaos of war. For the American soldiers, the effect was both practical and psychological. Each time a German bomber released its payload on empty ground, the men who were spared felt a surge of relief. That relief turned into confidence, and confidence hardened into resilience. No longer did they feel like prey, helpless beneath the endless watch of hostile aircraft. Instead, they began to believe that the enemy could be fooled, that the balance of power was not as fixed as it once seemed. The balloons had shifted the mindset of those who relied on them. The wider strategic consequences were equally significant. Commanders who once allocated precious time and resources to defending every convoy could now maneuver with greater freedom. Supply lines stretched a little farther, real tanks rolled a little bolder, and infantry moved with less fear of immediate detection. Every balloon in the field was more than an object of deception. It was an opportunity to redirect the enemy's focus. It allowed the Americans to fight not only with guns and steel, but with time and space, elements often just as valuable in the calculation of war. Imagine the frustration in a Luftwaffe command tent as reports came in from pilots who claimed to have destroyed American armor, only to find no evidence on the ground afterward. Resources wasted, missions misdirected, and confidence undermined. The very structure of German air strategy began to fray. This was not just a matter of bombs striking empty fields, but of trust between pilot and commander breaking down. When the eye of the Air Force could no longer be trusted, the hand that guided the bombs grew less steady. The balloon decoys also reshaped the psychology of combat itself. For the first time, American troops realized that survival was not solely about matching force with force. Ingenuity could create a shield just as effective as armor. To soldiers who had endured nights of terror under relentless bombing, this realization was transformative. It gave them not only safety, but also a sense of control over their fate. The fragile decoys, once dismissed as absurd, became symbols of hope. In the end, the wider consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. They reached into the very structure of military planning, altering how the Americans thought about deception and strategy. The Luftwaffe, once a predator without fear, was forced into hesitation and second-guessing, and hesitation in war could be as deadly as any bullet. By undermining the certainty of the German Air Force, the balloons helped tip the balance of momentum, proving that sometimes survival could be secured not through brute force, but through clever illusions that wasted the enemy's strength. The climax of the balloon deception came when these fragile illusions ceased to be scattered tricks and became woven into the very fabric of Allied operations. What had started as a desperate experiment transformed into a deliberate tool of war. The Americans began placing balloons with calculated precision, not merely to draw fire, but to reshape the enemy's understanding of the battlefield. Entire fields bloomed with inflated silhouettes, lines of supposed tanks stretched across the horizon, and mock artillery emplacements pointed toward the sky. To German pilots sweeping overhead, the scene was convincing. It looked like strength gathering for an assault. In those moments, the Luftwaffe's most trusted weapon, its eye in the sky, became unreliable. Pilots reported massive buildups of troops and equipment, confident in their findings. Commanders responded with urgency, diverting bombers and resources to destroy what they believed were vital concentrations of force. Yet when the dust settled and the smoke cleared, all that remained were shredded balloons and empty ground. The silence of wasted destruction spoke louder than any explosion, for it revealed that the Germans had struck at nothing. For the soldiers on the ground, the climax was not always visible as a grand event, but as a series of narrow escapes. Imagine crouching in the mud as bombs thundered against fields just beyond your position. The sky lit with fire, the ground shook violently, but your own equipment and comrades remained untouched. The balloon decoys had absorbed the fury of the Luftwaffe. When the echoes faded, the soldiers understood the power of their unlikely allies. Victory, in that moment, was measured not in ground gained, but in lives spared. These illusions were not invulnerable. Balloons were punctured, torn apart by shrapnel, or flattened by the very bombs meant for them. Yet their destruction was part of their triumph. Every decoy shredded to pieces meant real tanks and artillery had survived. The soldiers who watched them burst did not despair. They celebrated. For them, the sacrifice of rubber and air was infinitely preferable to the loss of steel and flesh. In this way, the climax of balloon warfare was not found in endurance, but in disposability. The deception reached its height when German command began to doubt even their most certain reconnaissance. What once had been a matter of instinct and experience became tangled with hesitation. Could they trust their pilots' reports? Could they afford to waste more bombs on illusions? Each unanswered question weakened their ability to act with confidence. And in war, hesitation is often fatal. It was here, in the collapse of certainty, that the balloons achieved their greatest victory. In the grand scale of the war, the climax of this deception was subtle, yet profound. No single balloon brought the Luftwaffe to its knees, but together, as a system of illusions, they eroded the effectiveness of one of Germany's most powerful weapons. By turning sight itself into a trap, the Americans had altered the rules of engagement. The climax was not an explosion or a charge, but the quiet victory of imagination over force, of illusion over steel. By the closing chapters of the war, the balloon decoys had secured their place in the story of Allied ingenuity. What began as an unlikely experiment had matured into a proven weapon of deception. saving lives and reshaping the battlefield. Soldiers who once mocked the inflatables came to respect them as silent guardians. They were not glamorous, they were not heroic in the traditional sense, but they shielded men from fire and allowed the war to be fought on more equal terms. The balloons, in their fragile simplicity, had become part of the arsenal of survival. The legacy of these decoys extended far beyond the campaigns of the Second World War. They demonstrated a principle that echoed through the halls of military, planning for decades to come. That victory often depends not only on force, but on perception. By manipulating what the enemy believed to be true, the Americans had shifted the balance of power without firing a shot. It was a lesson in the art of deception, one that would inspire future strategies across conflicts where information and illusion mattered as much as guns and armor. For the men who lived through those days, the memory of balloons rising into the sky remained vivid. Imagine standing in a field at dusk, watching the silhouettes inflate, fragile shapes tethered against the evening wind. You know they will not stop a bullet. You know they will not fire back, but you also know they may draw the enemy's wrath away from you. In that moment, hope takes the form of rubber and rope, a strange but vital symbol of survival. The memory of their protection lingered long after the war had ended. In the final reckoning, the story of balloons and deception is more than a tale of military trickery. It is a testament to human imagination under pressure, to the ability to turn the simplest materials into shields against the most powerful machines. The Luftwaffe's dominance was not broken by balloons alone, but their certainty was fractured by them. And in war, when certainty crumbles, so too does strength. Today, the image of balloon decoys may appear quaint, almost comical, yet their legacy endures in the strategies of modern armies. They remind us that warfare is not only measured in explosions and battles won, but in the quiet victories of survival and cleverness. The balloons of World War II were fragile things, yet they left behind a story that is anything but fragile. Their lesson is timeless, that sometimes the lightest objects can carry the heaviest weight in the struggle between life and death.